Welcome back. So today we're going to do another quick one on the latest set from NF Acoustics or NF ACOUS. This is the NA20. So for those of you who have followed NF Acoustics and NF Audio, you'll recognize the shell. Very, very similar. They always tend to do slight tweaks to it, and I'm sure this one has a slight tweak to it. The driver is almost the same story. It's a very similar single dynamic driver, but then there's always a little change to it as they continue to do kind of almost continuous development on their dynamic drivers, and each one is slightly different. As I said, cable is actually quite nice copper colored twisted style, actually quite nice. Inside the package is very, very similar to other NF acoustic sets that you may have looked at in the past. So one thing that I will point out on this particular set is this is actually part of their music series. And if you look at the graph, you can kind of understand what is going on. And I will say that when you look at a graph like this, it can go one of two ways. You can either say it's a really big V-shaped set. It's going to be high energy, lots of bass, lots of treble, very energetic. And that's certainly one way to look at it. That's not necessarily NF Acoustics' way to tune or who should really appreciate their sets. You know, they really started doing professional vocal-centric sets, and that's what you're seeing right here. In the music series, you can kind of see in the red, that's the NA20, so they kind of relaxed their typical heavily vocal emphasized upper mid, and then added a little bit more bass. And again, when you look at this at almost think of it as a typical set, it's way too boosted. It doesn't really work. When you think about it in terms of a lower volume set, kind of a long session, professional musician, someone's going to be wearing this for hours with a volume down quite low, this all sounds quite different, and actually it does sound very balanced. It does get some warmth from this bass shelf. This comes across as more relaxed than something like the NM20. And again, the whole thing kind of makes sense along with the music series. When you hear it at lower volume, it is a softer, warmer version, but still similar to what NF Acoustic has done in the past. So what is this one? This one is a beryllium-plated diaphragm dynamic driver, and as I said, the tuning is a little bit relaxed from their professional series. This one is the music series, and it's definitely in a similar style to the professional NM20, but they tilted the tuning to sound warmer and more musical. And again, they kind of boosted the bass a little bit and brought this down. Those two changes are just going to sound warmer, and especially at lower volume, they come across much warmer. You don't have that cleanliness and the sharpness that you got on an M20. This is a much softer, more relaxed style set at lower volume. And like other NF acoustic models, this one is meant to have detailed vocals at lower volume. As I said, the NA20 really tilts the tuning, so the lower end has more presence and warmth at lower volume, more balanced at lower volume to hear everything rather than the professional, which is really sharper and cleaner. And again, this one, I'll say the graph doesn't make a lot of sense because you really had to turn down the volume. And when you turn down the volume, this essentially flattens the V. You don't have as much boost as it appears on the graph. Very much a different set at low volume. And for those of you who are just familiar with their portfolio of sets, they all tend to be lower volume sets. If you try to listen to them at higher volume, if you go into it thinking I'm just going to EQ this down a little bit and it'll be fine, they don't really tune that way. They have a very specific intention and purpose behind their tuning, and they all tend to be very similar. And the NA20 is very much along the lines of the same exact style tuning, just a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more warm, a little bit more warmth, but you're still going to have the detailed vocals that you got there. They're not going to really remove that from their style. And again, as I said, the tuning is really only part of the sound. Volume plays a huge part in this graph, and really finding the balance. You definitely have to turn down the volume, and it'll essentially let you know when you've hit the spot where the person who tuned this set kind of was just about listening to it at the same volume. If you go too low, you essentially lose the body and the vocals, and it doesn't really sound correct or right or all that pleasant. If you go too high, then this starts to kind of take over, and things kind of go in the opposite direction. They get thinner and brighter. Right in the middle of that is kind of a relaxed, warm style vocal with some body to it and some weight to it. And as soon as you hear it, you can kind of bounce between the upper point and the lower point and kind of figure out exactly what he was listening to when he tuned it. And I will say that NF Acoustic they are really good at this style, but it's really a preference and it's a listening style. As I said, you wouldn't really buy this set to EQ it or even, assume that you're going to monitor something like that. This one is meant to be enjoyed as it was tuned along with their other sets in this particular style. So the bass, again, the graph looks really big, but at lower volume, it sounds more of a glide. It has kind of more of a lower presence to it, but, it is still a vocal-centric tuning, and I think there is more. Both sub bass and mid bass do have a presence, and again, it's a little bit hard to see this and think about it at what happens at lower volume. But just think about it as a lower style glide. You do get both sub bass and mid bass presence, and both of those kind of fit right into the vocals to give you that weight, to give you the depth. And again, it's actually a really, really well done low volume set because of that bass presence. And this is a warm sound that you don't expect, but it really fits the music series, as I said. And I would say in the realm of low volume, the bass shelf is much more musical than most neutral bright, even NF Acoustic's own sets. It's really well done at low volume. Mid bass has some thump to it for pop music. And again, I've actually talked about this before. So at low volume, you essentially drop the bass shelf down. So if you have a neutral bright, you're going to drop that down, and then this is kind of popped up, and it's very hard to get bass presence, both mid bass and sub bass, at lower volume on neutral bright. This is a better approach, and again, as I said, at higher volume, it doesn't make any sense. It looks over boosted. But when you think about this in terms of lower volume and really bringing the sub bass and the mid bass into a level which can be heard at that particular volume, NF Acoustics is really good at that. And again, they've been doing this for a long time. They kind of know what they're doing, but you do have to go in under the assumption that you're going to listen to it as it was meant to be listened to and how it was tuned. Otherwise, it's not going to be all that pleasurable of an experience for you. And the mids, again, it's a mix of NF Acoustics vocal-centric tuning, but softened and warmed and definitely more musical. The weight is still lighter. And again, I think it's kind of hard to get away from being too thin with this amount of upper mid, and again, this whole bass shelf looks really big, but it's really to support the amount of boost that they have there, and the two at lower volume do kind of come into some balance, and you will get some weight to the mids, but they still do lighter and cleaner. They don't really lose that DNA that NF Acoustic has built up over the years of that style tuning. Very, very clear vocals, a lot of clarity that's not really lost here, even though it's the music series. But NA20 really kind of volume scales down, but don't go too low, as I said. You need that bass contribution to sound full, but if you keep turning it up, it'll get thinner again. You really want to listen for the body and the vocal to hit the right volume. Again, as I said, it's not that hard to figure out what the right volume is for this set. You just kind of turn it down, and then it'll start to sound a little less natural. There'll be a whole range of volume right kind of at the lower, and that'll sound about right. And then as you get a little bit too high, you'll start to hear that take over, and it'll get thinner again, and just kind of play with the two endpoints of that volume range. And it's not that hard to figure out where this one can sound its best, and kind of where it was tuned at as well. And the treble, again, the lower treble and the upper mid is sort of the focus on these style sets. But the upper mid is really boosted and to be present at lower volume, and it's can't really see this out here. So this part out here, so as I said, NF Acoustics typically does upper mid style tuning, vocal focus, that's what you're seeing here. They do an upper treble boost as well. And again, that is all about making it audible, present at low volume. And much like the bass, the upper treble is very, very hard to hear at lower volume. It's very hard to get a sense of stage and a big stage without doing some kind of boost like this for lower volume listeners, and that's exactly what they did. And again, the NF Acoustics is just really, really good at doing this style tuning, and when you hear end to end what it sounds like at low volume, it all makes quite a bit of sense. But this style boost out here won't work at high volumes at all, but at lower volumes, it does expand the stage. It does add a little bit of resolve to the mids and just gives you a little bit of that sparkle. But again, lots of low volume sets out there. Not many really get the balance of what this sounds like end to end right, and being able to hear everything end to end at lower volume. And NF Acoustics just happens to be one of those brands who does it well. So that is what I got on the NA20. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.